Picture this. The year is 1668. Somewhere off the southern coast of Cuba, the afternoon heat lies heavy on the water. A Spanish treasure galleon, 600 tons of Basque oak, her hull scarred black with pitch, 32 cannons behind closed gun ports, sits low and sluggish in a dying wind. She is the Nuestra Señora del Carmen, and in her belly she carries 80,000 pesos in silver plate, 40 bales of indigo, and 12 chests of Peruvian emeralds bound for Seville. Her crew of 210 men watch the horizon through brass spyglasses and see nothing but flat Caribbean blue. Then a sail appears. Not ahead, where the convoy escorts watch, but behind, rising fast from the south-southeast. A single mast, a sharp cedar hull the colour of wet teak, 40 feet of Caribbean sloop, drawing barely 6 feet of water, heeling hard under a spread of canvas that should be too much for a vessel that small. She is doing 10 knots. The galleon, fully laden, is doing 4. The galleon's captain orders the gun ports opened. By the time the first broadside is loaded, the sloop has crossed his stern, the one angle where his cannons cannot reach. She fires a rake of grapeshot across his quarterdeck and vanishes behind his own hull shadow, faster than his helmsman can turn the rudder. She is a leopard circling an elephant. She can choose when to bite. She can choose when to run. And the elephant cannot follow her into the shallows where she will disappear. This is not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. And that is the point. For more than 200 years, the Spanish galleon was the most powerful vessel on the Atlantic Ocean, a floating fortress designed to carry the wealth of empires across hostile seas. But it was not designed for this. It was not designed for an enemy that refused to stand and trade broadsides, that could sail where the galleon could not follow, and that could choose its battles with a speed the galleon could never match. This is the story of how the biggest, strongest, most heavily armed ships in the world were made obsolete, not by a superior navy, but by 40 feet of cedar and a crew of 70 men with nothing to lose. To understand why the galleon failed, you first need to understand what it was built to do, because it was never built to hunt pirates. The Spanish galleon evolved in the 1530s from earlier vessel types, the caravel and the carrack, and by the mid-16th century it had become the backbone of Spain's Atlantic empire. A typical galleon measured 100 to 150 feet in length, 40 to 50 feet in beam, with a length-to-beam ratio of roughly 3 or 4 to 1. Atlantic galleons ranged from 500 to 1,000 tons. The largest Manila galleons crossing the Pacific could reach 2,000. They carried 20 to 60 cannons depending on their role, and their crews numbered between 180 and 400 men. Building one required up to 2,000 trees, oak from the Basque Coast, mahogany from Havana, tropical hardwoods from the Philippines, and could take 2 full years. Spain organized these ships into a system called the flota, regimented convoys sailing fixed routes between Seville, Havana, Veracruz, Portobelo, Cartagena, and Manila. The system began formally in the 1560s under the Casa de Contratación, and it worked. For over a century, the flotas moved staggering quantities of silver, gold, emeralds, silk, spice, cochineal, and indigo across the Atlantic with remarkable regularity. The treasure galleons were the freight trains of the Spanish Empire, enormous, predictable, and very, very slow. And therein lay the problem. The galleon's design prioritized cargo capacity and defensive firepower above all else. Spanish galleons had thicker hulls than their English or Dutch counterparts, better able to withstand cannon shots, but heavier and more sluggish in response. Their towering stern and forecastles, those signature features that made them look so formidable, acted as sails in a crosswind and made them clumsy to handle. A galleon under optimal conditions could make 8 knots. Fully laden, in the variable winds of the Caribbean, 4 to 5 knots was closer to reality. And their draft, the depth of hull below the waterline, ran to 15 or 20 feet, which meant they were confined to deep channels and open ocean, shallow coastal waters, river mouths, coral shoals, the maze of keys and inlets that line the Caribbean. These were all forbidden territory for a galleon. For most of the 16th century, this did not matter. Spain's enemies fought on her terms, fleet against fleet, broadside against broadside. The English race-built galleons that harried the Armada in 1588 were themselves large warships, just lower and faster. But by the late 17th century, the rules of engagement had changed. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 and then the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended successive European wars and dumped thousands of experienced sailors onto the Caribbean labor market with no legitimate employment. These men knew how to fight, how to navigate, and how to handle ships. What they lacked in firepower, they intended to make up in cunning, speed, and the willingness to fight dirty. They did not need galleons, they needed sloops. The Bermuda sloop, the vessel that would change everything, was not designed as a weapon of war. It was designed as a cargo carrier. Developed on the islands of Bermuda in the late 17th century and refined by Jamaican shipwrights who built parallel designs from local cedar, the sloop was a single-masted, fore and aft rigged vessel, typically measuring 40 to 60 feet in length and displacing 30 to 100 tons. Built from lightweight Bermuda cedar, resistant to rot, displeasing to marine borers, and considerably lighter than the oak used in European shipyards. The sloop was fast. Under favorable conditions, a Bermuda sloop could reach 12 knots, roughly 3 times the laden speed of a galleon. More importantly, her fore and aft rig, using triangular sails rather than the square sails of European warships, allowed her to sail much closer to the wind. A galleon could not effectively sail upwind at all. A sloop could tack into it and still make headway. But speed was only half the advantage. The sloop's draft, the critical measurement of how deep her hull sat in the water, was a mere 5 to 8 feet. Compare this to the galleon's 15 to 20. The sloop could sail over coral reefs, through narrow channels between mangrove keys, up river mouths, and into shallow bays where any pursuing warship would run aground. She could also be careened, hauled onto a beach at low tide for cleaning and repair, far more easily than a galleon, which required a proper dockyard. A clean hull meant she stayed fast. A fouled galleon, her bottom encrusted with barnacles and weed after months in tropical waters, only got slower. The sloop carried 5 to 15 cannons, a fraction of the galleon's armament, but her crew of 20 to 70 pirates did not intend to exchange broadsides. They intended to close fast, rake the enemy's stern or bow where her guns could not bear, and board. The sloop was also fitted with sweeps, long oars that could be pushed through the gun ports, allowing her to move in a dead calm when a becalmed galleon sat helpless. And she needed only 5 to 10 men to sail in normal conditions, which meant a pirate crew of 50 had 40 men free to fight. Historical records bear this out with striking clarity. Sloops comprised roughly 61% of pirate vessels during the Golden Age. The most feared names in Caribbean piracy, Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Edward Teach before he acquired the Queen Anne's Revenge, all operated sloops. When Henry Jennings sailed from Jamaica in late 1715 to raid the Spanish salvage camp on the Florida coast, he did it in the Bathsheba, a 10-gun sloop of just 40 tons. His partner John Wills sailed the Eagle, 35 tons. Between them, these two tiny vessels carried away 120,000 pieces of eight from under the noses of the Spanish Empire. The contrast could not be starker. A 600-ton galleon requiring 2,000 trees and 2 years to build, versus a 60-ton sloop built from Bermuda cedar in a matter of months. 200 men to crew the galleon, 20 to sail the sloop, 20 feet of draft against 6, 4 knots against 12. The galleon was a cathedral. The sloop was a knife. The vulnerability of the treasure fleet was not a secret. It was a slow-motion disaster that played out across 2 centuries, and the Spanish knew it. As early as the 1570s, Francis Drake demonstrated the principle. Drake's raids on the Spanish Main relied not on matching Spain's firepower, but on refusing to engage it. His pinnaces, small, fast, oared vessels, struck at ports, supply lines, and isolated merchantmen, then vanished into coastal waters before the galleons could respond. At Nombre de Dios in 1572, Drake hit the treasure depot with a raiding party launched from pinnaces, seizing a mule train loaded with Peruvian silver. The galleons at Cartagena were still loading when he was gone. In 1586, he sacked Santo Domingo and Cartagena itself with a fleet built around speed and surprise, not raw tonnage. A century later, Henry Morgan refined the tactic to devastating effect. When Morgan struck Panama City in 1671, his fleet consisted almost entirely of small vessels, sloops, barks, and longboats. His vanguard under Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bradley stormed the fortifications at San Lorenzo in a bloody assault on January 6, 1671, a fight won by infantry, not broadsides. With the fort taken, Morgan carried 1,400 men up the Chagres River in canoes and small craft, crossing the isthmus on foot and by water. The Spanish garrison at Panama expected a naval assault. They got an overland march and a land battle. Morgan understood what the galleon's designers never fully grasped. The fight did not have to happen on the water at all. But the most devastating single blow came from the Dutch. On September 8, 1628, Admiral Piet Heyn of the Dutch West India Company, commanding a fleet of 31 warships with over 2,300 sailors, intercepted the Spanish Nueva España Flota in the Bay of Matanzas, Cuba. The Spanish fleet, 11 merchantmen and 4 escort galleons under General Juan de Benavides, had sought refuge in the bay after spotting the Dutch on the horizon. It was a fatal error. The galleons, cargo of silver, had been loaded so heavily that their artillery was inoperable. Their crews could not maneuver for defence. Heyn's faster, lighter vessels blockaded the bay mouth and closed in. The Spanish surrendered with almost no resistance. Heyn's forces captured or scuttled 16 ships and seized a cargo valued at approximately 11.5 million guilders, roughly equivalent to an entire year's budget for the Dutch war effort against Spain. It was the first and last time anyone captured a major portion of the Spanish silver fleet, and it was accomplished not through superior firepower but through superior speed, scouting, and tactical positioning. The galleon's own mass had trapped them. Nearly a century later, the pattern repeated in a different key. On July 31, 1715, a combined Spanish treasure fleet of 11 ships, carrying an estimated 14 million pesos in silver, gold, and trade goods, departed Havana for Spain under the commands of Captain General Juan Esteban de Ubilla and Don Antonio de Echevers y Zubiza. They had been delayed for months by bureaucratic disputes and bad weather, and they left late, deep into hurricane season. 7 days later, a hurricane struck the east coast of Florida. All 11 ships were wrecked. Over 1,000 sailors perished. The only survivor was a French frigate, Le Griffon, whose captain had wisely sailed further from shore. What followed was a textbook demonstration of asymmetric warfare. The Spanish established a fortified salvage camp at Palma de Ayes on the Florida coast and, using native divers weighted with rocks, began recovering silver from the shallow wrecks. By early 1716, they had recovered a substantial portion. Some estimates suggest 80% of the registered cargo, but the salvage camp was exposed. When Henry Jennings learned its location from a captured Spanish mail ship, he sailed his 40-ton sloop directly to the camp, overwhelmed the defenders without casualties, and carried away 120,000 pieces of eight. The Spanish Empire had spent months, hundreds of men, and enormous resources recovering its treasure. Jennings took it with a sloop and 14 divers. The effect on Caribbean piracy was immediate and explosive. The governor of Bermuda reported in 1716 that over 1,000 pirates were living in Nassau, vastly outnumbering the town's 100-odd legitimate inhabitants. Privateers who had been operating under questionable commissions from Jamaica's Governor Hamilton abandoned even the pretense of legality. The wrecks of the 1715 fleet became, as one historian put it, the gunshot that started the race, and the runners were all in sloops. Here is where the popular image and the historical record diverge so sharply that they might as well be describing different centuries. In film, in fiction, In video games, the iconic pirate ship is a galleon, massive, bristling with cannon, flying a black flag from towering masts. The Black Pearl in Pirates of the Caribbean is impossibly fast for her size. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, in the same franchise, is a floating fortress with supernatural powers. In Assassin's Creed IV, Black Flag, the player commands the Jackdaw, technically a brig, but upgraded to fight galleons head-on, which is precisely the kind of engagement a real pirate would have avoided at all costs. The historical record tells a different story. The majority of pirates in the Golden Age never commanded anything larger than a sloop or a brigantine. When they did capture larger vessels, as Blackbeard did when he took the French slave ship La Concorde and refitted her as the Queen Anne's Revenge with 40 guns, they often found them more trouble than they were worth. Large ships needed large crews. Large crews needed feeding. Feeding needed resupply, which meant port calls, which meant exposure to the authorities. A pirate sloop could disappear into a mangrove creek. A 40-gun frigate could not. Even Bartholomew Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age with over 400 captures to his name, understood this calculus. Yes, Roberts eventually commanded the Royal Fortune, a 40-gun warship, but the vessel that made his early career was a captured sloop, and it was a sloop that first chased down the Portuguese treasure ship Sagrada Familia in the Bay of Bahia, Brazil, in 1719, netting Roberts 40,000 gold moidores and a diamond-set gold cross intended for the King of Portugal. A sloop took a galleon's treasure, not the other way around. The Spanish, for their part, eventually recognized the problem. Spain's Armada de Barlovento, the dedicated Caribbean patrol squadron, was chronically underfunded, undermanned, and equipped with vessels too large to patrol the shallow coastal waters where pirates actually operated. By the 1720s and 1730s, Spain was transitioning away from the galleon entirely, replacing it with the navio, a purpose-built ship of the line, and the fragata, a smaller, faster frigate. The treasure fleet system itself limped on until the late 1770s for Atlantic convoys. The Manila galleon route persisted until 1815, but the galleon as a vessel type was already an anachronism by the time the Golden Age of Piracy ended. The sloop had not just beaten the galleon, it had made the galleon irrelevant. There is a reason Hollywood prefers the galleon. It is cinematic. It fills the frame. Its towering masts and carved stern galleries and rows of cannon ports project power and grandeur in a way that a single-masted sloop simply cannot. When Disney needed a ship for Captain Jack Sparrow, they gave him the Black Pearl, a ship that, in the logic of the films, is supernaturally fast, despite being the size of a small warship. The franchise acknowledged the real tactical truth: speed wins, but could not resist dressing it in the grandeur of a galleon. Assassin's Creed IV, Black Flag came closer to the mark. The game opens with the player aboard one of the ships of the 1715 treasure fleet, historically correct, and the protagonist, Edward Kenway, escapes the hurricane by stealing a brig, which he renames the Jackdaw. A brig is not a sloop, but it is far closer to the historical reality than a galleon. The game captures the essential tactical dynamic: speed, maneuverability, and the ability to choose your engagements. When you attack a galleon in Black Flag, you circle it, raking its stern, avoiding its broadside, exactly the way real pirates fought. The Netflix series Black Sails, set in the years immediately following the 1715 fleet disaster, builds its entire first season around the wreck treasure. And the sloops and small vessels of Nassau's Pirate Republic are far more historically accurate than anything in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Captain Flint's Walrus is a square-rigged warship, but the show also features the smaller, faster vessels that were the real workhorses of Caribbean piracy. The romance wants the galleon. The record demands the sloop. There is a lesson buried in the ribs of every Spanish galleon rotting on a Caribbean reef, and it has nothing to do with treasure. Empires build for dominance. They build the biggest, the strongest, the most heavily armed. They build systems, convoys, schedules, fortifications, designed to project control over vast distances. And for a long time, it works. The Spanish treasure fleet moved more wealth across more ocean for more consecutive years than any logistical system in human history before the railroad. It was an engineering triumph. It was also a trap, because the galleon could not adapt. It could not shrink. It could not speed up. It could not follow the sloop into shallow water or up a river mouth or through a coral pass. Every innovation that made the galleon better at its original job, thicker hulls, more guns, higher castles, deeper holds, made it worse at the job that history actually demanded, fighting an enemy that refused to play by the rules. The pirates understood something that the admirals of the Casa de Contratación never could. You do not win an asymmetric war by matching your enemy's strengths. You win it by exploiting the gap between what they were built to do and what they actually need to do. The galleon was built to carry treasure. The sloop was built to take it. And when the rules of the game changed, when speed mattered more than armor, when shallow water mattered more than deep, when a crew of 70 with cutlasses mattered more than 32 cannons that could not turn fast enough to track a target, the galleon had nothing left. David did not beat Goliath by becoming a bigger giant. He beat him by refusing to be one. There is a reef off the coast of the Dominican Republic, Banco de la Plata, the Silver Bank, where the currents run warm and clear over white sand at 60 feet. If you dive there, as salvage crews have done since the 1970s, you will find what is left of the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, a Spanish galleon that went down in a hurricane in 1641, carrying a fortune in silver. Her cannons are fused to the coral now. Her timbers are gone, dissolved by 3 centuries of salt and worm and tide. What remains are the things that do not rot: bronze fittings, iron anchors, ballast stones, and silver coins scattered across the reef like the scales of a dead fish. A reef shark patrols the wreck line. A Nassau grouper lives in what was once the powder magazine. The sea does not care who built the ship. The sea does not care how many guns she carried, or how thick her hull was, or how much silver was in her hold. The sea takes everything at the same speed: the galleon and the sloop, the empire and the pirate, the cathedral and the knife. The only difference is how long you stayed afloat. And the sloops, the cedar sloops of Bermuda and Jamaica, the fast little ships that rewrote the rules of warfare at sea, they are gone too. Cedar rots. Wood dissolves. Nothing remains of the Bathsheba or the Eagle or 100 other pirate sloops whose names we never learned. They were built to be temporary. They were built to be fast and light and disposable. And in being all of those things, they outlasted every galleon that ever tried to catch them. Somewhere on a Caribbean reef tonight, the bones of a galleon are settling deeper into the sand. The tide moves over them in the dark. The silver is still there, waiting. But the sloop that took the rest of it, she is long gone. She was always too fast to catch.